Chapter 1. Joy kept smiling as they drove the last few miles to the Culpepper ranch. She knew that's what her sisters needed from her, so that's what she gave them. All 6 girls in her family had silly names, but only she was expected to live up to hers. Since she was a tiny girl, she'd known it was her role in life to be joyful, and so she'd been joyful. The others were really on her nerves, especially Hope and Chastity. Chastity was a pain in her backside, as usual, but it was Hope's reaction that really annoyed Joy. She knew Chastity was a brat, but Hope knew she was too. Usually, Hope didn't let Chastity bother her the way she was then. Of course, with this being their 3rd day in the car, they were all feeling angrier than usual. The long trip had been a test of their loyalty to one another. As quadruplets, they'd always functioned as a unit, and they still were. Right then, they were just a very angry unit. When they stopped in front of the huge 1-story ranch house, Joy opened her car door and walked away from the car, away from the house. She needed a minute before she met or talked to anyone, or she wouldn't be able to fulfill her role in this world. Taking deep breaths, she stared off at the mountains in the distance, realizing those mountains might just be her center here in Wyoming. She could hear excitement behind her, but she had no desire to join in. She was going to meet her future husband in a few minutes, and she really needed to be able to live up to expectations when she did. Finally, she felt like she could smile and be the joyous woman she was expected to be, so she turned and walked toward the house. Her sisters who were with her, Hope, Faith, and Chastity, had already gone into the house with Dr. Lachelle and Linda Culpepper, her future mother-in-law. As long as one of the men was interested in her, at least. She worried the men would all want her sisters, and none would be willing to even look at her. Joy felt like she was too awkward to ever really find a man who would care about her. She'd never been kissed, but as far as she knew, out of the 4 of them only Chastity had been. Chastity made it her business in life not to live up to her name. Opening the front door, Joy walked into the house, smiling sweetly. Dr. Lachelle rushed over to her, hugging her tightly. "Joy. It's good to see you." Joy had a special fondness for Dr. Lachelle, but really, she couldn't think of anyone who wouldn't. The woman just lit up a room as soon as she entered it. Between her purple hair and colorful language, she was truly special. "I'm glad to finally be here." Dr. Lachelle looked at Joy, studying her for a moment. "Rough car trip?" Joy smiled, feeling like her face would break. It was long. For once, she would like to yell and scream about how awful her sisters had acted, but she wouldn't. "I'm sure it was. I know you 4 are close, being quadruplets raised as you were, you'd have to be. But 2.5 days in a car with 3 siblings? I don't care if you're in your 70s. Someone is going to want to kill someone else. Are you putting on your psychologist hat with me, Dr. Lachelle? Do I need to?" Dr. Lachelle took Joy's arm, pulling her a bit down the hallway and lowering her voice. "I worry about you. Your sisters are so easy to read, but you always have the exact same smile on your face. It's like you are incapable of showing any emotion that isn't positive." Joy shrugged. "I'm Joy. You don't always have to exemplify your name, you know." "I'll keep that in mind," Joy said, with the exact same smile on her face Dr. Lachelle had just complained about. Dr. Lachelle sighed, obviously concerned. "You have my number. Please make sure you use it if you need me." "I do. I'm sure you'll be visiting to check on us as well." "Of course I will. Don't do anything you don't want to do, Joy. Live for yourself for a change." "I'll do my best." But Joy knew she wouldn't. It was her job to make the people around her happy. Her mother had told her that repeatedly over the years. Joy moved around Dr. Lachelle to where Chastity was leaned over a countertop talking to a blonde woman. She looked to be in her early 50s, so Joy assumed she was their future mother-in-law. The woman looked up and smiled. "You must be Joy." Joy nodded, feeling ridiculously shy. Yes, ma'am. Are you Mrs. Culpepper? The woman laughed. Well, only if you're feeling very formal. Call me Linda. Joy smiled and nodded. Sounds good. Thank you for letting us stay with you for a while. Your home is lovely. She looked around her, spotting Faith sitting off by herself on the sofa. There was no sign of hope. She must have needed a minute to herself as well. Not sure what to do with herself, she wandered over to sit beside Faith. She seems nice, she said in a whisper. Faith nodded. She really does. Are you as happy to be out of that car as I am? I really thought Hope was going to strangle Chastity for a minute there, and I wouldn't have blamed her. Joy shook her head. So happy to finally be here. Are you calling Mom and Dad tonight? Joy frowned. I don't want to, but one of us has to. I don't plan on telling them where we are, just that we've found some nice Christian men and are being well chaperoned. Difficult talks with their parents always fell to Joy. She wasn't certain why, but it had always been that way. Good idea. Faith looked over the top of Joy's head at something. Oh, my. I called dibs on the sexy one. Joy turned her head, wishing immediately she had a tissue. Am I drooling? She asked softly. All three of them are sexy. She'd been attracted to a few boys in college, and she'd once even had a crush, but these three weren't boys. They were men with a capital M. Which one do you like? Faith asked, her voice a whisper. The one in the middle. Joy had always been fond of dark men, and that Culpepper Cowboy had hair as black as night. She wanted that one, but really? They were all pretty darn sexy, making her feel things in the pit of her stomach. Would she really be married to one of them within a month? Sleeping with him? Faith sighed. I don't know how we're ever going to choose. Asterisk. Let me help. Chris said, his voice filled with exasperation. Carlin handed him a board. Sure, hold this. He went back to work on the fence, pounding in a nail and wrapping barbed wire around it. By this time next year, I think we'll be able to afford electric fences. Colby glanced over his shoulder. Those cost an arm and a leg. How could we do that with the kind of acreage we're looking at fencing in? Carlin shrugged. A little at a time, I guess. Colby looked down at his watch for the third time in 5 minutes. Aren't any of you guys as nervous as I am? Nervous? Carlin asked, his voice perfectly calm. What's there to be nervous about? Colby shook his head, refusing to believe none of his 3 brothers had profusely sweating palms like he did. Within a few hours they were all going to meet 4 women, and they were required to choose one to marry, and marry her, within a month. How could they do that? He took a deep breath. What if they're all money-hungry snobs, who've come here thinking ranch life is like they've seen on Dallas? Don't be a nervous twit, Colby. Dr. Lachille vetted them. My friend Trey says she's brilliant at what she does, Chris said, still holding the board. What do you want me to do with this, Carlin? Carlin shook his head at his brother. Just keep holding it. Colby frowned. I'm not being a nervous twit. Did your friend Trey tell you about how crazy Dr. Lachille was? Did he mention her purple hair and strange outlook on life? Chris shook his head. Well, no, but she wouldn't send women we shouldn't marry. Carlin's text tone sounded, and he reached into his pocket for his phone. They're here. Mom says to get to the big house right away. Chris looked at the board he was holding. What should I do with this? Oh, just lean it up against the fence post. You can hold it again next time, Carlin responded. Chris rolled his eyes, but did as he was told. Colby took a deep breath, trying to calm his nervous stomach. How was he supposed to find someone to spend the rest of his life with? Was divorce a possibility? He needed to reread the contract as soon as he could. He mounted his horse, following his brothers. What if there wasn't one he liked? Or worse, what if there was? Would he be able to hide his emotions? He couldn't give a woman the kind of power over him that Rochelle had wielded. He'd carried an engagement ring around in his pocket, looking for just the right moment. Then she'd gone to volunteer at the underwear model shoot. After the snow had cleared, Rochelle had admitted she'd spent the 4 days of the blizzard doing the horizontal polka with one of the models. He still had the ring. He forced all thoughts of Rochelle from his mind. Rochelle was the past, and he was about to meet his future. Whatever her name was. When they reached the house, Carlin veered toward the back. "You go on," he called. Kolby, Cooper, and Chris went to the front door and into the house. Colby's eyes immediately caught a girl with bright red hair and green eyes, who was sitting on the couch with a girl who must have been her sister. He was too intent on the red head to notice a resemblance. Oh, the girl made his heart beat faster. He walked to the couch and stopped a foot behind it, her eyes wide as she stared up at him. "Hi. I'm Kolby." "Hi, Kolby," said the girl, her voice soft and sweet. "I'm Joy." "You certainly bring me joy." Joy's face lit up with a smile. He was a romantic. That's what she needed. A man who would bring romance to her life. Her sisters didn't need the kind of romance she did. Faith just wanted to work on her babies. Hope wanted to control the world. Chastity only needed sex, and a lot of it. But Joy needed love and romance. She was aware of Faith talking to one of his brothers, and Chastity falling all over herself for another. She blocked them all out though. Kolby. Kolby was meant for her, and she was going to take advantage of that fact. "Tell me about yourself." Kolby walked around the long couch and sat on the love seat that was at a 90-degree angle to it. He patted the spot beside him, and Joy stood up, moving to sit where he'd indicated. "Hi," she said again. Kolby grinned at her, his arm going to the back of the couch, not exactly around her, but it felt like it. "Hi," his voice was deep and a bit gruff. Just hearing him speak sent a little thrill through her body. "I'm a cowboy. We 3 older brothers work the ranch, while Chris, the youngest, is an itinerant science teacher." Joy nodded. She could understand him wanting to go his own way. "I see. Do you like being a cowboy?" He smiled. "There's nothing else in this world I'd rather be doing. I love to be out on the range, the sun and wind on my skin. I love being on horseback as we move the herd. I'm not big on mending fences, but I'll do it when I need to." "Sounds like you're living the life you want to live." She liked that idea. Being married to a man who was happy with what he did would make it easier on her. "I am. I guess I never realized just how privileged I am. I may not be a rich man, but a man is always blessed if he can wake up in the morning and do what he wants to do more than anything." Joy nodded, her face lit up. "That's right. It must be an amazing feeling to do just what you want to do." "You don't do what you want to do? What was your job back home?" "I don't even know where you're from." Joy made a face. "I'm from a small town in Kentucky, and I've never had a job. Our parents thought that our jobs should be looking for husbands and learning to be good wives. I've never even had a job as simple as flipping burgers." "Well, I don't know that you should have had a job flipping burgers," Kolby said with a wink, "but something would be good." "What do you do with all your time?" "We all have crafts we enjoy. Hope sews and spends a lot of time volunteering with children. Faith makes the most beautiful dolls you've ever seen. Chastity knits, and she makes wonderful socks." Kolby couldn't help but notice she left out what she did. "And Joy? What does Joy do?" Joy frowned. "Do you promise not to laugh?" He nodded solemnly. "Why would I laugh?" I make houses and furniture for Barbie dolls out of plastic canvas. Her words were merely a mumble, like she was ashamed of her craft. Really? I've never even heard of such a thing. What's plastic canvas? Joy jumped up from the love seat and went to fetch the small bag that was leaning up against the couch where his brother, Cooper, now sat with one of her sisters. She sat back down beside him, a little closer this time. She wanted to feel his warmth. Reaching into her bag, she pulled out a small rectangle of plastic canvas. This is what it looks like before it's worked. Then she held up the bag itself, which was 3 different shades of green in a pattern. This is what it looks like worked. This bag was one of my first projects. And you make stuff for Barbies from it? He knew what a Barbie doll was, of course, because everyone did, but he'd never really been up close and personal with one. They'd lived out in the country his whole life, and he only had brothers. His only cousin was male. How would he have been around Barbies? Yes. Joy's eyes were dancing as she stuck her hand back into her bag again, this time pulling out a book. These are instructions on how to make a castle. A castle? You can make a castle from that stuff? I love doing it. It's fun for me. My sisters and I will all sit around and talk while we work on our crafts. Well, all except for Grace, but she talks to us while her cakes are baking. Okay, so how many sisters are there total? Just the 4 of you who came? Joy shook her head. No, there are 6 total. 4 came here, she trailed off, leaving the words, to marry you and your brothers, unspoken. Hope, Faith, Chastity, and I are quadruplets. Grace and Honor are our little sisters. They're 2 years younger than us. Twins? No boys? Nope. Just the 6 of us. Kolby wiped the back of his hand across his brow. That's a lot of girls to look out for. Joy shrugged. Our parents were so strict it didn't seem to matter. We were only allowed out of their sight when absolutely necessary. We were never allowed extracurricular activities. I think that was mainly due to Chastity, though. Chastity? He asked. Which one is Chastity? Joy realized then that this man really didn't know her sisters. She'd never had to introduce her sisters to anyone, because they were something of a legend in their hometown. Quadruplets weren't the norm anywhere. There, she said, pointing toward the kitchen where Chastity stood with one of his brothers. Chastity was rubbing on his brother's arm and making eyes in a way that made Joy deeply embarrassed for her sister. Instead of continuing to watch, she pointed out the others. That's Faith. She pointed to the other couch where Faith sat with another of his brothers. I think Hope is still on the back porch, but I'm not sure. Kolby nodded. Back porch, huh? That explains where Carlin went. I'm sorry? Joy had no idea what he was talking about. When we got to the house, Carlin went to the back porch, and Cooper, Chris, and I went to the front door. Carlin must be with your sister, Hope. He shook his head. Did your parents stop having kids because they ran out of names? Joy shook her head. Oh, no. They had Charity, Patience, Prudence, and Harmony already, in case they had another set of quadruplets. Do any of your sisters suit their names? He asked, a half grin on his face. She shook her head. Not a one of them. Grace is the clumsiest girl you ever did see. Chastity, well, we're not going to talk about Chastity. She's technically chaste, even if her thoughts are far from it. Hope is usually hopeful, but she has her moments of doubt. Honor has honor, I guess. As much as anyone, but not more so. Faith has faith, but again, about like anyone. And Joy? Is she filled with joy? Kolby couldn't believe the odd conversation he was having with her. He reached out and traced her cheek with his index finger. Joy nodded. My parents always talked about how I was the only one to really live up to my name. She didn't mention what a turmoil her thoughts usually were. She wasn't trying to deceive him, but what man would want a woman who wasn't joyous? He smiled at that. I like that quality in a woman. He wanted to kiss her. He'd met her 15 minutes before, and already all he could think about was kissing her. She'd be fine to have babies with, but he really didn't want to lose his heart. They both jumped when the back door opened and Hope came in with his brother. Carlin, she thought. He announced they were getting married. Joy's eyes widened. Already? She'd expected Hope to be the first among them to marry, but to be engaged within 15 minutes? Hope did everything first, but this was extreme even for her. Joy stood and walked to where Carlin and Hope were talking, sensing that Kolby was right behind her. After a brief discussion they left again, and Joy looked at Kolby with surprise. Well, that was quick. Kolby rolled his eyes. Just like Carlin. He found the one he wanted and immediately proposed, so there was no chance of anyone else getting her. Joy bit her lip. Does that mean you'd rather be with Hope as well? He opened his mouth to reassure her, but thought better of it. I don't know. I've never met the girl. I've only met you. Joy nodded slowly. Of all the sisters, she was the only one who wasn't asked out on a regular basis. She had always felt minuscule when compared to the personalities of her sisters. Would you like me to introduce you to the others? He shook his head. Not now. Let's go for a quick walk. A walk? Joy was confused. Didn't he care when Hope and Carlin were getting married? Surely he did. He nodded firmly. A walk. I want to get to know you without all these eyes on us. Joy looked around the room. She didn't feel any eyes on her. Linda and Dr. Lachille were talking. Hope was on the back porch with Carlin. Faith was still on the couch with one of his brothers, and Chastity was, well, it looked like Chastity was trying to lose her virginity in the dining room, but that was neither here nor there. Okay, she said, not certain what bug had crawled up his butt, but she didn't really care to find out. She was tugged toward the front door by him, smiling tightly at Faith as she passed her on her way out. When they reached the open air, he kept her hand in his, walking around the side of the house toward the stable. I don't know what you know about the ranch yet. We have 5 houses here, one for each of us, and Mom lives here in the big house. I see. What she saw were mountains off in the distance, and she wanted to go to them. She wanted to drag Kolby off and beg him to have a picnic at the base of one of the mountains. She wanted romance in her world. She wasn't so certain that Kolby would be able to deliver on that as she had been in the moments after they'd first met. I've lived here since my dad died when I was 2. I'm sorry. You must not have any memories of him. He shook his head. No, I don't. My granddaddy made a great substitute father, but I always felt like something was missing. I can understand that. Kolby walked down a path of rocks with animals painted on them toward a small bench. Once he reached the bench, he sat down, turning to face Joy. I didn't really want to walk. Joy stared at him with wide eyes. What did you want? I wanted to kiss you somewhere we wouldn't be seen. Kay, kiss me? She'd never been kissed in her life. She'd have been astonished to hear anyone had ever wanted to kiss her. He nodded. Do you mind? Joy swallowed hard. I guess not. No one has ever kissed me before. As soon as she'd blurted the words out, she was embarrassed by them. She shouldn't have told him that. What would he think of her? He stared at her in shock. You've never had a boyfriend? Joy shook her head. No, we were never allowed to. Our parents firmly believed that your first kiss should take place after you speak your vows, before a pastor. Wow. Colby wasn't even sure what to say to that. I didn't know there were any girls who were even virgins in this country past the age of 20, let alone unkissed. He frowned at her. Please tell me you're over 20? His voice was slightly panicked. She giggled at that. We're 22. Oh, good. I won't feel so much like I'm cradle robbing then. He was 29, which was 7 years older than her, but that didn't bother him like her being under 20 would have. He stroked her cheek with one hand, moving his fingers into her hair, and tilting her head to one side. I'm going to kiss you, Miss Joy. Joy nodded, her eyes drifting closed as his mouth came down on hers. His lips were soft, gently moving against her closed mouth. She put her hand on his shoulder, unsure what she was supposed to do to participate in the kiss. Her parents had never kissed in front of them, and she'd never been allowed to watch much television. Kisses were foreign to her. He raised his head, a grin on his lips. Yup. You definitely live up to your name. That kiss brought me joy. She smiled at him, blushing slightly. She liked that kiss. It was nice. Chastity had talked to her about kisses with tongues, but she knew it would be a long time before she was ready for something like that. Years maybe. I'm glad, she whispered. I think I like kissing. He chuckled, already feeling the tug of his heart. This girl was awfully special. We should probably go back in and see when Carlin and Hope are going to marry. I have a feeling we'll be attending a wedding today. Do you really think they'll do it that quickly? If I know my brother, and I do, he's already called the preacher. Chapter 2. During the short reception Linda had for Carlin and Hope, which took place just hours after they'd met, the men's cousin showed up. He made some demands and threatened to take them to court before leaving. In short, he wanted 1/5 of the ranch, and nothing else would satisfy him. After he'd gone, the sisters all exchanged glances, and Joy could see there was already a plan. Whatever it was, she was on board, of course. She had marketable skills and would happily use them. After they'd all had a light snack, Colby once again asked Joy to go for a walk. She agreed, explaining to Linda where she was going. She could tell it annoyed Colby a little, but she knew that Linda was acting as her chaperone, and she wasn't about to be rude to her. He led her a different way this time, explaining the layout of the ranch. I really want to show you my house. Joy glanced up at him in the late afternoon sunlight. You know I'm not willing to get frisky with you, don't you? He laughed, the sound filling her with delight. Yes, I know. No hanky-panky or premarital diddling. I've been given the same memo you have. Dr. Lachelle had made all of them sign contracts explaining about no premarital sex, and all of the sisters had to be married within a month of their arrival or the men had to settle $10,000 on any who weren't. She blushed. Well, that's fine then. I just want you to see my house. I want you to know where you're going to live if we end up tying the knot. All right. She followed him to a small house and waited as he opened the door for her. She noted that he didn't bother with a key. She'd lived in a small town, but they'd still felt the need to lock their doors. She liked the idea of living somewhere where people didn't bother with locks. Walking into the house, she immediately noted that it was bigger than she'd thought. As she stepped inside, there was a kitchen and connected dining room off to the left. To her right was a living room, complete with a large screen television. She wondered if he watched television in the evenings, and her mind's eye saw the two of them sitting cozily on his couch, her working on her plastic canvas and him watching the TV. It sounded lovely to her. His room was big, with a bed definitely large enough for two. There was a connecting bath with both tub and separate shower. Then they walked down the hall in the other direction, and there were 2 rooms that seemed to be used for storage more than anything else. As she peered into one of the rooms, she smiled, noting the windows were facing the east. I'd love to use this room as a craft room. Kolby nodded. I think that would be fine. He caught her hand, pulling her toward the living room and the comfortable-looking couch. Sitting down, he drew her down beside him. Now, I want to introduce you to something most girls learn when they're teenagers. Her eyes focused on the television. Would he show her some sitcoms? She'd always wanted to sit for hours in front of the TV with her crafts. What's that? Making out. She laughed. I don't know if your mother would exactly approve of that. He looked over his shoulder. I don't think she's here. Well, no, but I think while she's my chaperone, we should at least be cognizant of what she'd approve of. He sighed. I just want to kiss you. If I promised to keep my hands above the shoulders, would that help? Joy thought about it for a moment before nodding. I think that would be fine then. As he was lowering his head toward hers, he whispered, You can put your hands anywhere you want, baby. His lips descended on hers as she stifled her laugh, her hands automatically going to the back of his neck. When his tongue came out to touch her lip, she was startled at first, but then she realized she liked it. She moved closer to him, and he moved his hand to her back. She pulled away to look up at him. That's below the neck. It's your back. Even Dr. Lachille would say that's perfectly fine. He kissed her again, this time his tongue found the seam of her lips, tempting her to open for him. Joy opened her mouth tentatively, wondering at what he would do. She felt like a child, not knowing anything about kissing, but at least she was willing to learn. When his tongue entered her mouth and stroked hers, she let out a gasp of surprise. She'd thought Chastity was making things up when she talked about how she'd kissed Bobby Banks at church one Sunday morning. She felt the kiss all the way through her body coming alive for him. Wanting to be closer, she imagined being in his arms with nothing between them. She pulled away, knowing why her parents had wanted them to wait for their first kiss. Kolby took deep, gulping breaths. I need to get you back to my mom's house. Joy nodded. I think that would be wise. I like kissing you a little bit more than I should, Kolby Culpepper. I'm very glad to hear that, Joy. He wanted a passionate woman in his arms, even if he was worried he might fall in love with her. Getting to his feet, he caught her hand and pulled her to hers. Don't get too comfortable at Mom's house. She looked at the back of his head as he pulled her toward the door, and she wondered briefly if he would always feel the need to pull her around like a child's toy. Joy was so glad he'd chosen her. She'd fully expected to be the last of the four sisters to be chosen by one of the men. As they walked back to his mother's house in the dark of the spring evening, she rested her head against his shoulder. Being accepted by him was important to her, and she was so thankful he'd not turned his nose up at her craft. Why, even her sisters made fun of it at times. At the front door, he pulled her into his arms and kissed her again. One to sleep on, he whispered. Joy smiled up at him, thankful he was there beside her. Will we spend tomorrow together? She asked. He shook his head. I'll be here for lunch, but my brothers and I will be working most of the day. We need to talk to figure out a plan for buying Travis out. Joy squeezed his hand. Don't worry too much about the money. We'll help. Kolby nodded, pretending to understand her. For women who had little training and had never worked, trying to help didn't seem like such a wonderful thing to him. Hopefully they had hidden talents somewhere. He didn't want to have to send his new wife off to wait tables in town, but he sure would if it was the only way to keep the ranch. Joy stopped in the kitchen to get a drink of water, noticing that Dr. Lachille and Linda were still talking nonstop. Have you two been friends long? She asked. Linda laughed. I met her when she came to do her testing on my sons. We just hit it off. Joy smiled. I love friendships like that. She'd had one or two, but her parents had always stopped them quickly. They thought having 5 sisters should always be enough, and there was no need for any of them to seek friendship outside the family. Did you have a nice time with Kolby? Linda asked, her eyes seeming to know exactly what Joy and Kolby had been doing. Joy nodded. Yes, I did. He's sweet. I hope you two will get married. As soon as I met you, I thought you were the one for him. Oh, thank you. That's so nice to hear. Be gentle with him, Linda cautioned. He's the only one of my boys who's ever been in a serious relationship and had his heart broken. I thought for sure they'd marry. Joy felt an overwhelming sense of jealousy, not even certain why. Whatever had happened was before she met him, so she had no reason or even any right to be jealous. I wouldn't hurt him or anyone else. I promise. Linda stood and hugged her. I'm so glad you're going to be part of the family. Do you need any extra blankets or anything? Joy shook her head. It's going to be strange to have my own room. I don't think that's ever happened to me. I've always shared with Chastity. Lachelle shook her head at that. I'm sure that girl made interesting noises in the dark. Joy blushed. If she did, I never noticed. She put her glass into the dishwasher. Good night. I'm so glad I'm going to be able to sleep alone for once, that I just can't express it. Linda smiled as she watched her go. That one seems more fragile than the others. I'm not sure why. Lachelle nodded. I think you're right. I haven't gotten into her head yet, but I will. Probably not this weekend though. Do you have to leave already? You just got here. I have a matchmaking business to run, and I still see clients in my mental health practice. Yes, I have to go. You know I'll be back to visit, though. It's so peaceful here. I miss living in Montana. Linda shook her head. I can't believe anyone would move from Montana to Manhattan. That's just crazy. Lachelle shrugged. I thrive on the city pace, but I sure do love coming to the country every chance I get. Asterisk. As soon as Joy got to her room, she took out her cell phone. It was 7, so it was 9 at home in Kentucky. She hated that she was the one designated to call her parents, but they'd all known as they made the arrangements that she would be. It was always her job to deal with them, because she calmed them better than the others did. She quickly punched in her mother's cell number and waited while it rang. It was answered on the second ring. Joy? Where on earth are you? Joy sighed. She'd called her mother's phone, hoping for the less volatile of the two of them. Hi, Daddy. We're in Wyoming. Wyoming? What are you doing there? What part of Wyoming? I'm on my way to get you. No, you're not. Hope is already married, and Faith, Chastity, and I have men we're courting here. We saw a Christian matchmaker, and she set us up with 4 men. When did you see a matchmaker? Joy bit her lip, knowing now was the time to admit to everything. Remember that weekend last month when we went into town to go to a friend's wedding? They'd lied about the wedding, of course, and that had been another situation like this one, with Joy calling after they were already in town. She hated disappointing them. Yes. There was no friend and no wedding. We met Dr. Lachelle, and she set us up. We're here to marry 4 brothers. Joy closed her eyes, waiting for the yelling to start. There was a long period of silence. Why didn't you just tell us? You know your mother and I have been wanting you to get married for years. We weren't sure if you'd approve of us seeing a matchmaker. In fact, we were sure you wouldn't. And we wanted to make you happy by marrying. And there was no way we'd ever find husbands under your rule. There was more silence, and Joy could tell she'd upset him. You'll let me know if something goes wrong and you need me? Of course, we will. Joy felt like she'd betrayed them when they'd just done everything they could to protect their children, but she knew they'd done the best thing for them. We love you, Joy. Tell your sisters we love them as well. Joy felt a tear slip down her cheek. We love you, too. Hug Mom and Grace and honor for me. Stay safe. With those words, he ended the call, and Joy threw herself on her bed and sobbed. If he'd been mean and demanding, she would have been fine. The hurt in his voice had thrown her off. There was a knock at the door, and Joy swiped the tears from her face, sitting up straight in bed. Come in. Dr. Lachille's purple head stuck through the door. You okay? I heard you talking. Joy nodded. I called my parents to let them know we'd arrived safely. Did you tell them you were coming here? Dr. Lachille didn't wait for an invitation as she sprawled across Joy's bed. No, ma'am. We didn't. I thought they'd be angry, but my father was actually sweet. I was prepared for anger, but not love. Dr. Lachille nodded. Sometimes that's harder. Are you okay? Joy sniffled, another tear tracking down her cheek. Mostly. I don't know why my parents turn me inside out like they do. They make all 6 of us crazy, but only I still have this intense feeling of loyalty toward them. I guess I'm crazier than they are. No, Joy. You just have a compassionate heart. That's a good thing. Dr. Lachille stood up and leaned down to press a kiss to Joy's forehead. Remember, anytime you need me, I'm just a phone call away. I have a feeling this is going to be tougher for you than any of the others. Joy smiled at the older woman. I'm sure I'll be fine, but thank you for caring so much. You'll keep my number handy, right? Yes, ma'am. I have it programmed into my phone. Linda is a good one to talk to as well. She's going to be an incredible mother-in-law to you 4 girls. Joy smiled. I can see that already. Thank you. Dr. Lachille closed the door softly behind her as she left the room, leaving Joy alone. Joy sighed. She was tired, but she wasn't sleepy. She pulled out her plastic canvas bag and worked on her current project, a Barbie couch. If she was going to help save the Culpepper Ranch, she needed to keep stitching. Chapter 3. Joy woke early the next morning, her body still on Eastern Standard Time. She wandered into the kitchen to find Linda making breakfast. How can I help? She asked, still wearing her pajamas. Linda turned a smile on her. Would you mind making the biscuits? Not at all. Where's the flour? Joy had made biscuits enough in her life that she had no problem whipping up a batch from the recipe in her memory. Flour? Oh, girl. Around here, we do everything the easy way. Can of Pillsbury is in the fridge. Joy's eyes widened. Pillsbury? What's that? And how can you have a can of biscuits? Linda stared at Joy as if she'd sprouted an extra 4 heads. You've never had Pillsbury biscuits? You poor deprived child. She reached into the fridge and plucked the can of biscuits off the door. Here. Just follow the instructions. Easy as pie. Joy stared down at the long tube in her hand. Where's the can opener? Can opener? Linda took the can back from Joy and efficiently peeled the label off before banging the tube twice on the counter. When the can popped, Joy jumped a foot. Is it supposed to do that? Linda nodded, her eyes full of laughter. Well, yeah. Your mom really never made canned biscuits? Joy shook her head. No, we always mixed the dough and rolled them out, and then we used a biscuit cutter. I didn't know there was another way to do it. Tell me something, Joy. Do you like to spend 6 hours in the kitchen cooking every meal? Joy shook her head adamantly. I don't mind cooking, but if it were easier, I'd take the easy way. At least she thought she would. Pillsbury is the easy way. You just pop open the can, remove the pre-cut biscuits, put them on a cookie sheet, and you bake them for the specified time. Doesn't get much easier than that. I feel like it's cheating. Joy did as she was told, separating the biscuits and putting them onto the cookie sheet. Is this going to be enough for everyone? Oh, good point. I don't even know if the boys are coming for breakfast. Make 3 cans. Joy went to the fridge and took 2 more cans out, carefully peeling the labels off, as Linda had done. She jumped again when the cans popped. It sounds like an explosion. Linda just laughed. That's just how they work. She reached to the drawer under the stove and took out another cookie sheet. Here. Go ahead and put them on both. Joy did as she was told, carefully spacing out the biscuits. Do you make cakes from box mixes and everything? Duncan Hines and Betty Crocker are my best friends. Don't tell me you usually make cakes from scratch? Linda looked appalled at the very idea. I do. I bake cookies from scratch too. Oh, yeah, I always bake cookies from scratch. Then I can make them just how I want them. Linda turned back to the sausage she was frying. I thought we could do biscuits and sausage gravy with scrambled eggs for breakfast. How does that sound? Sounds good. Honestly, Joy had never had that for breakfast. Her mother had been a fanatic about healthy cooking. She could see there was some real adjusting she would need to do living there. When she finished with the biscuits, Linda had her beat the eggs for the scrambled eggs. I figure we'll just make enough for whoever shows up. Hope will come for breakfast, Joy told her. Don't you think Hope will make breakfast for Carlin and eat with him? She usually will. Not today. She's going to come for breakfast so she can talk to us about our plan to save the ranch. Linda turned to Joy. You girls haven't had a chance to talk since Travis was here. How do you have a plan to save the ranch? Joy shrugged. We just do. We've always had that intuition thing going that multiples have. As soon as Travis left, Hope gave me a look that let me know she'd be here this morning. We'll talk about it over breakfast, and we'll have a strong financial plan by noon. We? Linda asked. Are you girls taking on our financial problems as your own? Of course, we are. That's what family does. And we're all about to be family. Hope is already your daughter-in-law, but Faith, Chastity, and I will be soon, too. We have to help. Linda smiled brightly. With 9 of us working together, I'm sure we'll be able to make it work. I'm going to warn you now, Hope is going to drag you into whatever scheme she has up her sleeve. She's pretty bossy. That comes from being the oldest. I'm sure it will all work out perfectly. Joy smiled as she set the beaten eggs on the counter. Yes, it would all work out perfectly. She was about to marry into a supportive family, and she couldn't wait. Asterisk. Hope showed up just after they sat down for breakfast. It took all of 10 minutes for her to explain her plan to everyone. Basically, each sister would work at her craft, and Hope would open a daycare in the big house, which they all would take turns helping with. Joy's job for the daycare would be working during nap time and filling in wherever else she was needed. She was chosen for nap time because hers was a quiet craft. Immediately after breakfast, Joy let her sisters help out with the dishes, since she'd helped with the cooking, and she wandered off to do some research on the internet. She needed to find the best way to sell her creations. She knew about Etsy and eBay, of course, but wondered if creating her own website would be smarter. She worked in silence until there was a knock on her door. Come in, she called, looking up from her laptop. Kolby walked into her room, closing the door behind him. He walked over and sat on the bed with her. What are you working on? I'm fine-tuning my part of the plan for helping save the ranch, she told him, thrilled he'd gone out of his way to search her out. She'd spent the night tossing and turning, wondering if she'd see him with Faith or Chastity today. He nodded, deciding to humor her. Hopefully the women could help a little, but he wasn't going to count on much. He spotted a little couch on her nightstand and stood up, turning it over in his hand. This is cool. Have you thought about selling these? Joy stared at him blankly for a moment. What a great idea. I'll have to do that. She wasn't usually sarcastic, but there were times it was just necessary to get her point across. He grinned. Maybe with this type of craftsmanship, she could help out with the ranch's finances. He sat back down, still holding the small couch. How long did it take you to make this? She shrugged. An hour or two. It only went that quick, because I've made that one multiple times. He set it down. Mom's got lunch almost ready. Are you hungry? Yeah. She pushed her laptop off her lap and onto the bed beside her. Are you done working for the day? Kolby nodded. Carlin declared this afternoon his honeymoon, so the rest of us are taking the afternoon off as well. Cooper'll probably work, but that's only because it's on his schedule. Schedule? Yeah, Cooper is nuts about his schedule. He won't deviate in any way. I think he's a little OCD. Joy thought for a moment and remembered that Cooper and Faith had seemed to be getting along swimmingly. His brother Chris was the one who Chastity had set her sights on. He seems nice enough. Oh, he's nice. All my brothers are good men. He's just kind of weird about time. He got to his feet and held a hand out to her, pulling her to him. Leaning down, he kissed her softly. "Morning, sunshine." She wrapped her arms around his neck, kissing him back. "Did you have a good morning working?" He shrugged. "We're working on fixing the last of the fences on the pasture. We'll move the cattle to this week." "So, not particularly." "I'm sorry. I don't think I'd like that either." He turned from her, opening the door. "Let's go eat." "I'm starving." He held her hand as they approached the table, noting that Cooper was fawning over Faith, and Chris looked like he was trying to find any flat surface to throw Chastity onto. "Lunch smells good, Mom." Linda smiled. "Faith cooked." "I guess that puts me on supper duty," Chastity said, breaking the kiss she was sharing with Chris. Joy answered. "Sure does. Your turn." Chastity trailed a finger down the front of Chris's shirt. "I sure hope you'll be here for supper." Chris grinned at Chastity, having eyes only for her. Joy wanted to roll her eyes, but she'd done her share of kissing in the past 24 hours. Maybe not as much as Chastity had, but who could keep up with Chastity? She wondered if Chris had any idea what he was getting into. Dr. Lachelle looked at Chris and Chastity. "Do you two remember the contracts you've signed?" "Yes'm," Chastity said demurely. Joy rolled her eyes at Kolby, squeezing his hand under the table. "Oh, yes, ma'am. Nothing will happen before vows are spoken." Chris's voice didn't sound at all convincing. Dr. Lachelle glared at the two of them. "Make sure it doesn't." After lunch, Joy went into the kitchen to help with the dishes, but Dr. Lachelle shooed her away. "I'm going to help, so I can have a little more time with my friend before I leave. Go enjoy your man." Joy blushed, looking over her shoulder at Kolby. Was he her man? Kolby held out his hand for her. "Do you like to walk?" She nodded. "Of course. Grab 6 bottles of water, and meet me out front in 5 minutes. Wear your most comfortable shoes." Joy nodded, rushing into her room to put shoes on. Since she'd been in the house all day, she hadn't bothered. Shoes were for going outside, not for hanging around the house. She'd never understand why some women loved shoes so much. She hated them. She put on a pair of sneakers and went to the kitchen. Kolby said to get 6 bottles of water. Linda nodded toward the fridge. "There's some in there. Do you need a bag to carry them in?" Joy shrugged. "I don't know. Probably. He said we're going for a walk." Linda frowned. "Wait here." Joy dug the water out of the fridge while she waited for Linda, who had disappeared. Linda returned with a backpack. This belonged to one of the boys when they were small. She handed it to Joy, who put the bottles of water into it. Taking it back, she added a small first aid kit that was on top of the fridge, and several packs of peanut butter crackers. That'll keep you. Do you really think we'll need all that? Linda shrugged. With Kolby, you never can tell. He's unpredictable at times, and he loves to hike. Joy took the backpack. Thank you. I appreciate the help. Linda smiled and hugged her. Be safe and have fun. I'll try. Joy headed for the front door, finding Kolby waiting for her in his pickup truck. She opened the passenger door and slid in beside him, immediately buckling her seatbelt. She set the backpack on the seat between them. Your mom added peanut butter crackers and a first aid kit. He grinned. That's my mom. She believes in being prepared for everything. He put the truck in reverse and backed into the yard. Where are we going? She asked. I thought we'd go there, he said, nodding toward the mountain range in front of them. Climbing? She asked, her eyes wide. She wasn't sure she was up to that. Not this time. There's a river at the base of the mountains, and we'll walk along the river. It's so peaceful there. That sounds nice. Kolby smiled. Trust me. It is. You're going to love Wyoming. It's one of the most beautiful places on earth. I just hope we can get used to driving in the snow in the winter. She had never even had her own car. Hope was given one when they started college, but she'd driven the others wherever they needed to go. I hadn't thought of that. With you girls being from the South, you haven't driven in snow much. We get some snow, but our father never let us drive in it. He didn't think women should ever drive in less than perfect conditions. He rolled his eyes. You'll have more freedom here. If you can't drive in snow, you can't drive. Joy smiled at that. I love the idea of having more freedom. It's strange to me the way you were raised. Why were your parents so strict? She sighed. Mainly, it was a religious thing. We went to a very conservative church and small Christian school. Our parents believed that women should have only one purpose in life, and that was to be good wives and mothers. Until such a time as they married, they should be training for marriage. That's really sad. What if one of you wanted to be a doctor? We weren't allowed. We all have college degrees, but we got them in homemaking. Hope has a minor in accounting, and Daddy almost came unglued when he found out what she'd done with her electives. Did you get a minor? He asked. She nodded. Psychology. How did your parents feel about that? They were fine with it when I told them I wanted to learn it to better choose a husband, and because I thought it would help me deal with my children in the future. Hope couldn't claim that with accounting. He chuckled. Good thinking. She stared straight ahead at the beautiful mountains. We're getting close, she whispered in awe. He smiled. I'm glad you like my mountains. I don't know how you can get any work done with them looming over you. I'd want to be here every day. He turned off into a small parking lot. This is as far as we can go by truck. The rest is walking. He snagged the backpack, putting it over one shoulder. Let's go. Joy could see a walking trail beside the river, and she eagerly climbed out of the truck. I do want to try to climb the mountain one day. He grinned. We'll have to get you some boots first. Those shoes will never work. I'd have gotten some if I'd realized how close we'd be to mountains. She stared up at the mountain closest, her eyes wide with wonder. He took her hand and led her to the path beside the river, walking at a leisurely pace. This is my favorite place to come when I'm feeling down for any reason. The water speaks to me, and having the mountains so close doesn't hurt either. I can see that. It really is beautiful here. I wish I'd brought a blanket and a picnic lunch. This would be a perfect spot for it. I've done that here many times. Have you brought women here before? She asked, not sure where the words came from. She really didn't want to know what he'd done with other girls. He nodded. Just one. I bet she was special. I thought so at one point. He thought of the engagement ring he'd bought her, and dismissed it again. He could sell it now, to help pay off the ranch. Joy waited for him to say more, but when he didn't, she let it go. She needed him to want to tell her things like that. Tell me about your grandfather. She'd heard all about the terms of the will, and was more than willing to have children to help out. Kolby sighed. He was a good man, and usually a fair man. That's why this will has thrown us off so badly. I mean, we knew he wanted us to all marry and have kids, but forcing it is kind of ridiculous. Was he close to your cousin Travis? It was all Kolby could do not to spit on the ground when his cousin's name was spoken. He was so mad at the idiot, he wanted to scream. Not at all. I mean, Travis would spend every summer on the ranch. He and Carlin are the same age. All four of us would be out on the ranch busting our butts, and Travis would refuse to even ride a horse. He spent all summer in the house playing video games, and he complained about how desolate it was here. He has no right to any of the money from the ranch. None of it. Is he married? Yes, and I think that's why Granddaddy was so good to him in the will. He's married and has a couple of kids, which Granddaddy wanted from all of us. Travis was the only one who listened. He shook his head. But why Travis would be willing to bankrupt us all just so he could get his hands on immediate money, I don't know. Joy squeezed his hand tightly. I'm sorry he's being so awful about it. We're going to make it work though. He looked at her with surprise. You sound like you've made it your mission to help. Of course we have. My sisters and I really are going to make enough money to make a dent in what you owe. Hope, Faith, and I are going into town tomorrow to see about starting a daycare. A daycare? Sure. An in-home daycare will bring in a lot. Hope will be running it with your mom's help. All of us will continue working on our crafts and we'll sell them. Trust me. We're going to make a difference. She didn't mention Faith's baby doll business and how profitable it already was, because she didn't want to betray Faith's secret. She knew her sister would eventually tell everyone, but it was her place to do so, not Joy's. He smiled, not sure how much their little crafts could possibly help, but he was willing to humor her. Thanks for being so willing. If we all marry into your family, the ranch will be our children's inheritance. Of course, we're going to help. I never thought of it that way. We knew when we came here, we were expected to have babies straight off. We all love kids and want them to have the best future possible. She stopped walking. Can we drink some of that water? He stopped, shrugging the backpack off his shoulder. Sorry. I should have offered you a bottle before we started walking. No, it's fine. I'm just thirsty now. She took the proffered bottle and opened it, swallowing deeply. They had just reached a wide point in the river, and she wanted to go a bit closer. Can we go down the bank? He nodded. It's steep. Can you manage? I'm sure I can. He led the way, and she followed closely behind. When they reached the bottom, she sat down on the bank of the river. Do you think it's too cold to stick my feet in? He laughed. It's April in Wyoming. I guarantee it's too cold to stick your feet in. She sighed. It looks so beautiful, and the sun feels warm. That river is fed by streams coming in from the mountains. It's going to be barely above freezing. Go ahead if you don't believe me, but you'll regret it. She smiled at him. I trust you. He sat down beside her, putting an arm around her shoulders. I'm glad you like it out here as much as I do. Rochelle hated it. She looked at him. Is Rochelle the girlfriend you brought here? She wanted to ask if she was the one who had broken his heart, but she didn't want to reveal how much his mother had told her. He nodded. Yeah. When he said nothing more, she let the subject drop. Thank you for bringing me here. I'm glad you shared your special place. He turned her face up to his. You're really special, Joy. She blushed, not sure what to say to that. No man had ever complimented her before. I think you're special too. He leaned down, kissing her, softly at first, and then more passionately. His hand moved to her waist, pulling her more firmly into him. Her hands moved behind his back, feeling the strength of his muscles through his t-shirt. This was a man who worked long, hard physical hours. His strength was obvious through the fabric of his shirt. She wanted to touch his bare skin, but she didn't know if she should. Well, she knew she shouldn't, but she didn't know if he felt like it was all right. As soon as the thought struck her, she moved her hands to the hem of his shirt, and slowly up under it, stroking his bare back. He let out a groan, letting her know that he didn't mind her touch at all. Kolby felt Gizmo spring to life, and he mentally told him to calm down. She's not ready for that yet, Giz. Her first kiss was yesterday. Gizmo tented against his jeans, making it perfectly clear he wasn't about to listen to reason. He pushed her down in the grass, looming over her to kiss her more passionately, his chest pressing against her breasts. He was careful to keep his hands on safe ground, not wanting to frighten her. Joy was startled to topple backwards, but it felt so good to have him pressing down on her. She brought one jean-clad knee up to rub against his thigh, wishing they could be closer. You're killing me, he growled, finally pulling away from her. Joy looked at him, shock on her face. I didn't mean to hurt you. He sighed. You didn't hurt me. Gizmo just got a little too carried away for comfort. Gizmo? You know. He had no problem saying the actual word for it, but had a feeling she would be a little shocked. Why Gizmo? She asked, surprised he had a name for it. Kolby shrugged. I don't know. Because Mom's word was tallywhacker, and I hated it. She giggled. Tallywhacker is interesting, but I agree. Gizmo sounds so much more dignified. She sat up and took a swig of her water. I am sorry I got you so worked up. I started it. He sat for a moment, staring out at the river. When are you going to marry me? Joy felt her heart leap into her chest. I don't know. When do you want to get married? Gizmo is screaming for 10 minutes ago. Think we can make that happen? She shook her head. How about in a week? Monday of next week. He frowned. Why do you want to get married on a Monday? Don't most people get married on a weekend? She shrugged. They do. I think Mondays get too much hate. This way, a day that is normally dreaded will be a reason to rejoice. It will make people happy. Will it make you happy? Joy nodded emphatically. Of course it will. Then we'll get married a week from tomorrow. He hugged her close. Gizmo and I will be counting down the hours. Joy blushed at that. Can Gizmo count? Not exactly, but I'll help him out. We are buddies after all. Of course you are. She slid close to him on the grass and kissed him again. I thought we should do that one more time to seal our engagement. Her mind was already on wedding preparations. She and Hope were the same size, so she could wear her dress. He could see she was thinking of something else, so he stayed quiet for a bit. We should probably get back, he finally said. Mom and Dr. Lachille will think I brought you out here and ravaged you. I'll tell them you didn't. She stood up, brushing the grass off her bottom. It's going to be a long week. That's what Gizmo keeps telling me. Are you sure you don't want to do it tomorrow? She nodded. I need a little bit. I was kissed for the first time yesterday. I want to enjoy being engaged for a week. He shrugged. I guess we can live with that. Joy smiled, standing on tiptoe to kiss him again. I sure hope so. Chapter 4. As the week flew by, Joy worked alongside her sisters, both in the daycare and making her crafts. She enjoyed getting to know Linda, and had some private time with Kolby every evening. Not nearly enough time with Kolby to suit her, but she understood they both had jobs to do. After attending Faith and Cooper's wedding on Saturday, Kolby took Joy for a drive, still dressed in their wedding finery. He surprised her by stopping at a small lake and getting out of the car. "What are we doing here?" she asked. She looked down at her shoes, which were not meant for walking any kind of distance. "Having dinner." He got out of the truck and came around, opening her door for her, holding her hand to help her down. "Those heels look like they're tough to maneuver in." Smiling, she happily let him assist her. She'd never been what she considered a modern woman. She liked old-fashioned values. "Thank you." "My pleasure." He hurried to the back of the truck and pulled out a quilt and a picnic blanket. "It's a little chilly, but I promise to keep you warm." Joy felt a trickle of pleasure settle in her stomach. This man, she already loved him. Yes, she'd only known him for a week, but he was kind and caring. She couldn't wait to start their lives together. He spread the blanket out, and she dug into the picnic basket. He'd made sandwiches and stuck a bag of potato chips in the hamper. She grinned as she saw it. There were some bottles of water as well. "It's perfect." She removed the paper plates and added a sandwich to each. "What did you think of the wedding?" Joy giggled. "I love Brother Anthony." "Have you talked to him about marrying us yet?" "He's agreed to do it." "Do you want to marry at the big house like Hope and Carlin? Or at the church like Faith and Cooper?" "I think I want to marry outside. Like in your mom's backyard." "Do you think she'd mind?" Kolby laughed. "Mind? When she's going to be getting grandkids?" "No, I don't think she'll mind. You could tell her you wanted to have the ceremony in her bathroom, and she'd just go about seeing how she could make it work." Joy blushed at the mention of grandkids. It felt so strange to think they'd be making love in just a couple of days. "How many kids do you want?" she asked. "We haven't even discussed that." He shrugged. "No idea. I don't know that I've ever really thought about it." "Well, you should think about it. What if I want 15 children? You know, there's always the chance I'll have litters like my mom did." She looked down, disgusted by the word that had often been used to describe she and her sisters. "How would you feel about having more than one baby at a time?" He was a bit startled at the prospect, but it made sense. He'd prefer one at a time, but he'd take what he could get. "I don't know. I know multiples are a lot of work. My mom had shifts of women from the church helping around the clock." She shook her head. "I don't think I'd mind twins, but 4 at once is a bit of a handful." He thought over her words as they ate. "You'd have help if that happened." "My mom would be thrilled. She'd have had a lot more kids if she hadn't lost Dad so young." "I can see that. She certainly welcomed my sisters and me with open arms. I don't think I've ever felt so included as I have with your family." "I'm glad." He took a swig of water out of the bottle in his hands. "I'm glad we're getting married." His eyes studied her in the waning light of evening. Everything about her was beautiful. He'd have to be more careful around her. His heart needed to stay strong enough to keep her out of it. Joy nodded, blushing a little. "So am I." She wanted to tell him she loved him, but she wasn't sure if the time was right. When she'd finished eating, he stood, holding both hands down to help her to her feet. She'd been sitting with her legs curled discreetly to one side, because she was wearing a skirt. Taking his hands, she gracefully got to her feet, looking into his eyes. Can you walk a little way in those shoes? She nodded. I think so. Truthfully, her feet already ached a little, but she was willing to go wherever he wanted her to go. With his arm around her waist, he led her to a huge rock about a 5-minute walk from their picnic spot. No one will steal your stuff, she asked, looking back over her shoulder. Nah. We won't be here long enough. I thought you'd like to watch the sunset over the lake. She sat carefully on the rock, not wanting to snag her dress. She had at least one more wedding to wear it to. Chastity and Chris had to be getting married soon, although they hadn't made any announcements yet. He sat beside her, pulling her against him. She shivered delicately, so he shrugged out of his jacket and put it around her shoulders. I think the sunset will be worth the chill. She leaned against him with a smile. The chill's a good excuse to snuggle. I'm never going to turn that down. He kissed the top of the head resting against his shoulder. He was starting to have feelings for her, and he didn't like that much. He'd talk to her about it. Soon. She had a right to know he'd never love her. As the sun slowly eased down over the mountains framing the lake, she let out a sigh of contentment. She was marrying a man she loved. No longer living under her parents' roof. And it was the most beautiful place on God's green earth. What more could she ask for? After the sunset, they walked back to the quilt they'd had their picnic on, and worked together to put everything back into the picnic basket. You're awfully quiet, she said. He'd said almost nothing since they'd sat down to watch the sunset together. Is everything all right? He nodded. I just watched a gorgeous sunset with my beautiful fiancé. What could be wrong? What worried him about his words was that he meant them with his whole heart. Was he falling in love with her? If he was, she could never know. He helped her into the truck and ran around to the other side, climbing in. She was still wearing his black suit jacket, and to him, she was the most beautiful sight on earth. Her long curly red hair spilled down over her shoulders, and her petite body huddled into his jacket. Without thinking through what he was doing, he unbuckled her seatbelt. Come here, you. She slid across the seat to meet him in the middle, the gear shift keeping her from getting too close. He slid the rest of the way, his arm going around her shoulders. He looked down into her eyes, caressing her cheek. Have I mentioned how beautiful you are? She smiled, her green eyes sparkling. Not nearly often enough. Have I mentioned how incredibly sexy I find you? Sexy, huh? Oh, yeah. She put her hand at the back of his neck and pulled his lips down to meet hers. They had taken walks and kissed every night that week, but every time she felt his lips against hers still sent a thrill through her body. Every time he touched her, she felt like her body was going to go up in flames. He was a special man, and she was so glad he was going to be hers forever. He kissed her with the passion he'd been trying to suppress all week. They had so little time in the evenings after dinner with the whole family to just be together. He gathered her closer, crushing her against him. Do we have to wait? Joy pulled away, frowning a little. Honestly, I don't want to, but I've already compromised my morals enough just by kissing you before marriage. I don't think it would be right if we did more. He sighed, resting his forehead against hers. Then Gizmo is going to insist we stop now. I want to kiss you forever. I want to take that blanket and spread it back out and lay you down, making slow sweet love with you. She shuddered, seeing in her mind what he was saying. She could picture him lying over her, kissing her. I'm sorry. He shook his head. There's no need to be sorry. We signed a contract stating we wouldn't do anything before marriage. Gizmo refused to sign, though. So he wanted to have his say. It was kind of you to speak for him. Kolby shrugged. That's just the kind of guy I am. Faithful to a fault. Obviously. She grinned up at him. Only 2 more days, And I'll be Mrs. Kolby Culpepper. And I'll be filled with joy. Or joy will be filled with Gizmo. Preferably both. She gasped at his words, playfully swatting his shoulder. You shouldn't say things like that. You're going to be my wife in less than 48 hours. I can say just about anything at this point. He kissed her one last time before pushing her away. Buckle up. We need to head home so I can return you to your chaperone. I wish we could stay here kissing all night, Joy said as she reluctantly did as she was told. Monday night, we will kiss all night. I promise. He winked at her before starting the truck. I can't wait until you're mine. She thought about telling him they could move up the wedding to Sunday afternoon, but really, she wanted the extra day. She loved him, but she needed a little more time before she was ready to make love with him. She didn't know why, but it still felt like it was wrong. He parked the truck in front of the big house, helping her down. Linda was sitting in the living room reading a book. How was your picnic? It was lovely. We watched the sun set over the mountains. Joy walked over to sit beside Linda, eager to talk about it all. Kolby looked down at her, wondering at her quick abandonment of him for his mother. He walked around to sit beside her, deciding to be part of the conversation, at least for a few minutes. She loves Wyoming almost as much as I do. Linda smiled. Of all my boys, you've always been the one who loves the mountains here the most. You don't love the mountains? Joy asked with surprise. Oh, I do. I just wasn't raised here. Texas is still in my blood. Sometimes I think I should move back, but I have no one there anymore. No, I belong here with my boys and my mountains. And soon your grandbabies, Kolby pointed out, his arm around Joy's shoulders. Joy blushed, not really wanting to talk about grandbabies with her future mother-in-law. Linda nodded emphatically. I'll take 3 dozen of those, please. Kolby laughed. I don't know. Joy wants 15 of her own. That would be more like 5 dozen, wouldn't it? I'll take 5 dozen. No problem. Joy smiled, leaning into Kolby, wishing he'd change the subject. The wedding was beautiful. Kolby laughed. I think that's my cue. She wants me to shut up. I'll go now. Then he turned her face to him and kissed her, right there in front of Linda. She was so embarrassed, but she wasn't about to push him away. I'll see you after work tomorrow. We've been doing half-days on Sundays. She nodded. Is it okay if we spend a little time at your house? I'd like to do an inventory of food and general cooking supplies, so I know what I need. Sure. And, this is going to sound weird, but I'd like to Skype with my parents tomorrow. I want you to meet them before the wedding. Kolby nodded. I can do that. He honestly hated the idea. He'd heard enough about her parents from her, and what his brothers had heard from her sisters, that he wanted nothing to do with them, but he'd honor her, and do what she requested. Kissing her softly, he got to his feet. See you tomorrow afternoon. After he was gone, she turned to Linda again. You did good with him. Linda smiled. I did good with all 4 of my boys. They're so different from each other, but they're good men. I think so, Joy said with a smile. I want a quick finger food reception like Hope had, if that's okay. Nothing much. Linda nodded. Sounds good. I'll make a small wedding cake as well. Where do you want to have the wedding? In the yard, if you don't mind. Kolby said you wouldn't. Not at all. It'll be nice to get the backdrop of the mountains in the wedding pictures. How on earth do you get anything done? I want to stand there and look at the mountains all day. I have no desire to work while I'm here. Linda laughed. Years of practice. When the boys were small, and I was keeping this house for my father-in-law, there was no time for anything but work. Now that there is, I find that I'm used to working. That makes sense. Joy stretched, kicking her shoes off and tucking her feet under her. Tell me about Rochelle. He told you something about her? Not much. I know her name, and I know she was an old girlfriend. What happened there? Linda shrugged. I don't know a lot, and I don't know if what I do know is something I should repeat. I will say she broke his heart. It's the only heartbreak any of the four have ever had, and he was angry and miserable for a good long while. I think he's ready to move on. She frowned. I'll add that I never liked her. She wasn't right for him, even though he thought she was. I'm glad she's out of the picture, because you're the right woman for my Colby. Joy smiled at the words. Thank you for welcoming us so warmly. It's nice to be accepted for who we are. You girls fill my heart with joy. I'm glad you're here. And I'm glad you're the one for Colby. I'm not sure your sisters could handle him. Joy hugged Linda and got to her feet, bending down to pick up her shoes. I'm getting married in my bare feet, and I don't care who protests. Linda laughed. That works. Good night. Joy wandered off to her room, sitting on her bed. Glancing at the clock, she saw it was after 9. With the 2-hour time difference, it was too late to call her parents to let them know Faith was married, and that she would be married on Monday. She'd tell them when she Skyped the next day. Instead, she sent a text message to her mother's phone, knowing her mom would have her phone off while she slept. Skyping you tomorrow at 9 your time. Much love. Setting her phone on her nightstand, she brushed her teeth and climbed into bed. Her mind was spinning. In 2 days, she'd be married to the sexiest man she'd ever met. The man she loved. Asterisk. On Sunday morning, Joy woke early and headed into town to go to church. She asked Chastity to attend with her, but Chastity had been out late with Chris and didn't seem to have any desire to go. The sermon from Brother Anthony was so different than any she'd ever heard at home. At one point in the middle of his talk on the love of Christ and what he did for his followers, he lost his place. After peering at the page in front of him for a moment, he called out to his wife in the front row. Lovey? I lost my place. Lovey, a gray-haired, always smiling, slightly more than a little past middle-aged woman, hurried onto the stage and looked at his notes for him. You're right there, Tony. Read the scripture from John next. Yes, Lovey, he said, smiling at her as she hurried off the stage. Looking around her, Joy could see no one even batting an eye, and she assumed Brother Anthony's shenanigans were commonplace. After church, people surrounded her, introducing themselves. Lovey hurried over and took over. Oh, Joy, I want you to meet my grandson, Marcus. I hear you have 2 sisters still at home. They should come out here and meet my Marcus. Joy blinked a couple of times, a slow grin spreading across her face. That's a lovely idea. What do you do, Marcus? Marcus frowned at his grandmother. I'm a lawyer. You are? What kind of law do you specialize in? He shrugged. I don't do criminal cases, but I do pretty much everything else. I may ask you to look over a will. Would you be willing to do that? Only if I don't have to marry one of your little sisters as payment. Joy choked on a laugh. I think you'd love my sisters, but whatever. Would you be willing to read it? Marcus nodded slowly. Maybe we could have lunch, and you could show it to me? Oh, I can't. She glanced down at her phone for the time. My fiancé and I are having lunch together at noon. I need to get back out to the ranch. Marcus frowned. Fiancé? I'm marrying Kolby Culpepper tomorrow, Joy said with a grin. He's a good man. I can see when I'm beat. Maybe I'll meet one of your sisters after all. Joy laughed and shook her head. I'm trying to get them out here, so maybe we'll make that happen. All right. I'll have Colby talk to you about the will. Does that work? Yeah, that's fine. He's got my number. Joy squeezed his hand. Thanks so much. She hurried out the church after that, ignoring the long line of men who had been waiting to meet her. When she got back to the ranch, she parked Linda's SUV in the driveway and hurried into the house to change before lunch. She liked the freedom to wear jeans she had in Wyoming. When she was dressed, she went out to find Linda and Chastity making lunch together. I'm jealous that Chastity will have you all to herself after tomorrow. That's why she'll always love me best, Chastity said, sticking her tongue out at her sister. I really do worry about you sometimes, Chastity. You and the rest of the world. Joy shook her head, but took the plates that were on the counter and set the table for 5. The assumption was that Hope and Faith would eat with their husbands. Linda only seemed to use paper plates. When Joy had questioned it, Linda had responded that she had better things to do than stand around doing dishes all day. It seemed to be like the biscuit thing. She was going to make life just as easy on herself as she could. Joy had just finished setting the table when the back door opened. Kolby had obviously taken the time to shower after work, because he was dressed in clean jeans and a skin-tight t-shirt. Joy's eyes traveled over him, liking what she saw. She walked to him and kissed him, forgetting there were other people there. Her hands were flat on his chest, and she kissed him with all of the passion pent up inside her. Kolby kissed her back, finally breaking away after a moment. Much more of that, and Gizmo is going to insist I take you home and forget all about the fact there's no marriage certificate, he whispered against her ear. Joy blushed, stepping back. The back door opened again, and Chastity ran to Chris, throwing her arms around his neck and kissing him. Joy rolled her eyes at the spectacle her sister was making of herself, and then she stopped. She'd done the same thing just moments before. She had no room to judge. Chapter 5. After lunch, Kolby took Joy to his house, and she rummaged around in his kitchen, making notes on her iPhone as she did. She made a list of things she needed to purchase. Kolby leaned against the counter and watched her. Finally, she turned to him. You have almost nothing to cook with here. I usually just eat at Mom's. She's lonely. She's lonely, where you don't feel like ever cooking for yourself? Joy asked. He walked into the kitchen, putting his arms around her. Well, you can interpret that how you want. He kissed her softly. Tomorrow night, I'm keeping you here. She smiled, stroking his cheek. That's the plan. He groaned, staring into her green eyes. You know, I think we should head to town. I don't know that being alone is good for us. And Gizmo was already starting to protest. She laughed. Let's go then. They went out to the truck, and while they drove, she told him about church that morning. Marcus said you should call him, and he'll read over the will for you. Why would he do that? Marcus had never gotten along well with the Culpeppers. He'd been in Chris's year at school, and he had always been jealous of the Culpeppers' success with girls. I offered to set him up with one of my sisters. Kolby let out a bark of laughter. That man has always coveted the Culpepper women. Did he ask you out? Joy blushed. Not exactly. He did. I knew it. Well, if he's willing to read over the will for the chance to be set up with one of your sisters, that works for me. They ran into several people Kolby knew at the grocery store, and he introduced Joy to each of them as his fiancée. Do you know everyone in town? She asked as they walked away from his old high school principal. Of course, I do. Carlin is the mayor of this town, and it was named after one of our ancestors. Colonel Culpepper was one of the first settlers in this area. I'll have to find a book about him. He sounds interesting. Oh, he is. We studied him in school. They walked to the checkout with Joy's huge cart full of stuff. I'm going to order the pots and pans I need online. I think it'll be cheaper than finding them here. He nodded. Almost always. The woman at the checkout squealed when she saw Kolby. It's been ages. Kolby nodded. How are things with you? Good. Just got back from California. We were visiting Rochelle and Neville. The baby is adorable. I hope you had a great time. Oh, I did. She asked about you. Kolby looked at Joy. I'm sorry, sweetheart. I didn't mean to be rude. This is Abigail. She's the sister of an old girlfriend. Abigail, this is my fiancée, Joy. Joy smiled sweetly at the girl, feeling hurt that the first time he'd used an endearment with her, it had been because of his ex-girlfriend's sister. It's nice to meet you, Abigail. Engaged? I heard a couple of your brothers got married. You too? I thought you'd never marry after Rochelle, she trailed off, glancing at Joy. I hope you two will be very happy together. We will. She's an incredible Christian woman with strong morals. Thank Rochelle for me the next time you see her. He paid for the groceries and headed for the exit of the store. He was moving so quickly, Joy had to practically run to keep up. What was that about? He shrugged. Nothing. I was ready to get out of there. You know I prefer being outside. She stood awkwardly, wishing she knew what had happened. Once they were in the truck, she tried one more time. Will you tell me what happened with Rochelle? He shrugged. It wasn't a big deal. We were dating, and I thought things were more serious than they were. A ranch on the other side of town had a photo shoot for male underwear models. When the women in town found out there were sexy men, they all ran to volunteer to help. There was a freak April blizzard, and they were trapped on the ranch for 4 days. Lots of weddings happened right after that. Rochelle's was one of them. Joy blinked a couple of times. What did he mean he thought things were more serious than they were? Were you engaged? He shook his head. Nope. Not engaged. He put the truck in reverse and pulled out of the parking spot. Within a minute or two, they were on the road, heading back toward the ranch. Do you still love her? Joy asked, her voice soft. I honestly don't think I ever did. Sure, I thought so at the time, but I couldn't love someone who was so wrong for me, could I? He wished she'd drop the subject, but he didn't know how to tell her to leave it alone. Joy frowned, staring out the window. She was in love with him, and he didn't seem to be over his ex-girlfriend. Not really the way she'd wanted to start her marriage. Instead of talking more, Kolby reached out and turned the radio up on his truck. The words of an old cheating country song filled the truck. It seemed appropriate, so he left it there. When they reached the ranch, he drove to his house and carried in groceries while she put things away. His cupboards had been bare, so she was setting up her own system of organization, certain he wouldn't care. She knew she was marrying a man who would expect her to bring him food and drink when he was hungry and thirsty. She'd never expected anything else from her life. Why don't I fix us dinner tonight? If you'd like, that is. I texted my parents and told them we'd Skype them around 9 their time, which is 7 here. He nodded, seeming distracted. While she went about the business of cooking for them, he turned the television on, becoming involved in a baseball game. Joy wanted to know how to end the coldness between them, but she really had no idea. While the casserole she'd prepared was in the oven, she walked over to sit beside him on the couch. Instead of cuddling against him as she usually would, she left an entire couch cushion between them. You don't have to marry me if you don't want to. Kolby muted the television with the remote in his hand and turned to her. I do want to marry you, but I think you know as well as I do that our marriage isn't for normal reasons. She nodded, swallowing hard. I know it's not. I have a lot of feelings for you, Joy, but they're not feelings of love. I want you. I want to spend every night making love with you. I like the idea of having children with you. but love doesn't enter into it, and I don't know if it ever will. I would prefer if it didn't, to be honest." His gaze was steady and his face serious. He didn't want to hurt her, and he needed to be brutally honest with her to spare her any pain. Joy felt her heart shatter as she nodded, meeting his eyes. "I understand." But she didn't. Of course, she didn't. How could she? "I'm glad." He reached out and squeezed her hand, trying to take the sting from his words. He was glad they'd discussed everything. She watched him for a moment, wondering how she could go on. Would she be able to have sex with a man who didn't love her? She sighed. She'd have to, wouldn't she? She'd come out there unsure if she'd find love through Dr. Lachille's machinations. Just because she'd found it so quickly didn't mean that Kolby was required to. "Are you angry with me?" he asked finally, after she'd sat silently for what seemed like hours, but was really only a minute or two. Joy shook her head. "Honestly, I'm a little hurt. I'm not sure how I feel about marrying someone who told me he never wants to love me." "Are you calling it off?" "I guess you could always talk to Chris, if you can pry Chastity's lips off him, that is." He was disgusted at the idea of her marrying his brother, but he couldn't keep her tied to him if it was just going to make her unhappy. "Is that what you want?" she asked, her voice calm. Did he really care that little? He shook his head. "No. I picked the girl I wanted that first night. I'm very attracted to you. I want to spend my life with you." Joy tilted her head to one side, trying to understand him. "So you're attracted to me. You want to spend your life with me. You want to make love with me. You want to have children with me. But you never want to love me. How does that even make sense?" Kolby sighed. "I guess it doesn't make a lot of sense, but it's how I feel." "All right. I guess I'll just have to live with that then, won't I?" She would never make a play for her sister's man. It wasn't in her. Besides, she was marrying the man she loved. Having her love returned would be perfect, but life was rarely perfect. After supper, she put the dishes in the dishwasher and reached for her iPad, moving over to sit beside him on the couch. "Are you ready to Skype?" she asked. He nodded, not wanting to do it, but knowing he would do anything for her after the way he'd hurt her earlier. He'd seen the sadness in the eyes that were usually filled with happiness. Taking her hand in his, he squeezed it tightly. "I want them to think we're in love," she whispered softly. "Please don't shame me in front of my parents." He put his arm around her and kissed her cheek. "I do care for you, Joy. I would never do that. Everyone in the world will think we're madly in love, if that's what you want." She nodded. "That's what I want." She couldn't be joyful otherwise. "Ready?" He took one corner of the iPad, and she held the other. Pushing the icon to call, she held his hand tightly again. Tears pricked Joy's eyes when her parents' faces jumped onto the screen. "Hi, Mom." "Hi, Dad. This is Kolby. We're getting married tomorrow." Her mother's eyes swam with tears. "That doesn't give us any time at all to get there. It's not going to be a formal wedding. Just something in Kolby's mother's backyard. Faith got married yesterday." "And Chastity? Is she still doing everything she can not to live up to her name?" her mother asked, her eyes chilly. "Chastity and my brother are talking marriage," Kolby said, having no idea if his words were true. As far as he knew, they were just going at each other like rabbits, but he wouldn't betray his brother or her sister by saying so. Joy's father frowned at him. "What do you do for a living?" "My brothers and I share a ranch. We're all hardworking cowboys." He didn't mention Chris's true vocation. Why would he admit to having a science teacher for a brother? "I see." The older man nodded. "Nothing wrong with good old-fashioned hard work." "No, sir. There's not. Kolby didn't particularly like the man, but he wasn't about to be rude. He'd been raised better than that. Joy smiled, her eyes lit up. I just wanted to let you meet Kolby before the wedding. This seemed like the best way. Joy's mother cried a bit. I hate that I can't be there for your wedding. At least you told us before you actually married him, though. I did what I felt was right, Mama. The others did too. I see. I'm going to let you go. I just wanted you to know that we're all happy, and I'm getting married tomorrow. Joy's father looked at Joy for a moment. Are we going to be able to see our grandchildren? He asked. Joy bit her lip, not sure how to answer that. Yes, of course you'll be able to see them, Kolby answered, understanding Joy's hesitation. You'll see them under supervision, and you'll never take them home with you. Her father nodded. Thank you. Take good care of my Joy. The screen went dark, and Joy felt tears streaming down her cheeks. I feel so bad for the way we ran off, but we didn't feel like we had a choice. I felt so stifled under their roof, but it was worse for the others. Kolby laid the iPad on an end table and pulled her into his arms, stroking her back while she cried on his shoulder. Do you want to go home? He asked, hating the idea, but knowing he'd let her go if that's what would make her happy. She shook her head. Back to Kentucky? No, I want to stay here with you. It's just hard to let them be angry with me. How are you going to get your sisters away from them? He asked. She shrugged. Grace has a car. Those two will just pack up and leave. They helped us a lot by distracting Mom and Dad while we were packing. You just left, didn't you? You snuck around and left without them knowing about it. Joy leaned back, looking him in the eye. It's the only way we could get out of there unless we'd married men our father handpicked. He sighed. I'm sorry you had to go through that. She shrugged. They love us a great deal. They just show love differently than most people do. Are you glad we talked to them? I think so. At least I won't have to feel guilty about marrying you without introducing you to them first. He frowned, seeing that her eyes were still sad. What can I do to make you feel better? She smiled. Why don't you walk me back to your mom's house? I still have a few things I need to do tonight, so I'm ready to get married tomorrow. I'm going to take Tuesday off work. My brothers are both nuts about schedules and working, but I'm taking a day with my new bride. He got to his feet, holding his hand down for her. Come on. I'll walk you back. He picked up her iPad, and holding her hand tightly in his, began the short walk back to his mother's house. Can you take off the whole day Tuesday? She frowned. I'm really not sure. Hope would let me if I asked, but I'd feel guilty. Why? She's going to have a day soon where she'll take a day off as well. You'll cover for each other. Neither of the others took the day after they married off. I feel like I'd be taking advantage if I did. Kolby sighed. Have you ever thought of yourself first? Even once in your life? Joy shook her head. My mom taught me that joy means Jesus first, others second, and yourself last. I need to exhibit joy, so I make sure I follow the formula to do so. He stopped walking for a moment and turned to her in the dark. I hope you don't burn yourself out by constantly doing for others. She smiled, standing on tiptoe to brush his lips with hers. I won't. He caught her by the hips and pulled her closer, his mouth coming down hard on hers. He wanted so badly to drag her back to his place. What would it hurt to anticipate their wedding vows by less than 24 hours? He stopped, pulling away slowly. It would hurt her. He may not be willing to love her, but he wouldn't hurt her. Let's get you back. He rested his forehead against hers, breathing heavily. I can't wait for tomorrow night. She raked her fingers through his hair. I can't either. She knew she shouldn't be so eager to marry a man who never planned to love her, but she was. She loved him, and she would be happy with him. She could live without his love. He smiled, keeping his arm around her shoulders as he walked the rest of the way back to his mother's house. Opening the back door, he called out, "I brought your little chick back to you safely." Linda walked over from where she'd been standing beside the dining room table sewing. "It's the last time you'll need to bring her back to me." Kolby looked at Joy with a grin. "I'm happy about that." "Are you going to be here for lunch tomorrow?" Linda asked her son. He nodded. "I plan to be. I'll get ready for the wedding immediately after work." "Do you two have everything worked out the way you want it?" Joy nodded, a smile on her face. "Yes, of course. I have already chosen flowers, and they'll be delivered. Brother Anthony and Lovey will be here at 7. All we have to do is show up." "Well, you sleep well." He kissed her cheek, his lips touching her ear. "I can't promise you're going to get a lot of sleep tomorrow night." She blushed, glancing over at Linda to make certain she hadn't heard. "Good night." Joy watched him go before turning to Linda. "I met Rochelle's sister today." "Abigail?" "She's sweet. She and Carlin were in the same grade in school." Linda kept methodically cutting strips of fabric for the baby doll quilts. "Did she say anything?" "She told Kolby that they'd just returned from seeing Rochelle and her husband in California." "Mentioned a baby." Kolby completely shut down. "I'm sure he did." "Did he tell you what happened?" "Yeah. She was part of the great underwear model caper." Joy made a disgusted face. Linda laughed. "Yes, she was. Trust me, Joy, that woman was not worthy of one of my boys. She had him wrapped around her little finger, and he would have done anything for her. Instead, she ran off looking for trouble." "Did he tell you she called him when she was 5 months pregnant, begging him to take her back?" Joy shook her head, her eyes wide. "Well, she did. He told her he wanted nothing more to do with her, and she'd made her bed, so it was time to lie in it. That told me everything I need to know." "That Kolby can't forgive?" "No, Kolby forgives easily. It told me that he never loved her like he thought he did." "Are you sure?" Joy needed to believe that Kolby really hadn't loved her, because that meant that his heart wasn't broken, and maybe eventually he would love Joy. "Of course, I'm sure. I wouldn't say it if I wasn't." Linda shook her head. "You need to not worry about Rochelle. You're 5 times the woman she was." Joy laughed. "Sure. I have a feeling Kolby doesn't feel that way. He didn't take her back, and he would have if there had ever been real love on his side. Keep that in mind." Joy nodded, walking around to the kitchen to get a glass of water. "I'll try. I sure don't want to spend the rest of my life feeling like I'm living in the woman's shadow." "Then don't let yourself. She's gone. You're his future. He wouldn't marry you if he didn't think he could be happy with you." "Thanks for the pep talk. Now if I can just make it through the day tomorrow without losing my mind with nervousness." Linda laughed. "You're going to be just fine. Good night." Joy put the glass in the dishwasher and headed off to her room, just then realizing it was her last night to sleep there. Only Chastity would be left. Climbing into bed, she set her alarm. Mornings came early on the ranch. She prayed for peace and calm the following day, adding at the end, "And please, God, let Kolby love me. I need him to."